living in Buffalo. When we moved to Toronto, I tried to carry on the same type of work that I was doing in Buffalo, and I found that it was really problematic because the same type of dilapidated landscape that really attracted me in Buffalo didn't exist in Toronto, or at least it wasn't obvious. It was very difficult to find. And one day, Bear accompanied me on a photo walk around Toronto. We ended up on Queen Street near Spadina, and there was a wall that had been tagged with the word towards culture revolution. So the wall didn't quite look interesting enough on its own. So what I did is I had Bear pose next to it, and the reason was that he was interested in photography. He was 7 years old at the time, and he was kind of bugging me about working in a darkroom. So I thought it would be good to have something of himself that he could actually print in a darkroom. As it turned out, when I had a chance to see the photograph, I was really surprised in terms of how it affected the way that I was looking at the urban landscape. I had been following this kind of street photographer tradition, and then I realized that as an Indigenous person living in the city, I didn't have that luxury of looking at the urban landscape in that way. It was really about addressing the absence, because Toronto at that time was interesting because it had such a large Indigenous population, but they were still invisible. And so when I made that portrait of Bear standing next to the wall, it set in motion this thought of, I have to start thinking in terms of being an interventionist in the landscape. How can you go about imparting an Indigenous presence in a place that was never constructed and developed for Indigenous people? Indians were supposed to be somewhere else living. Well, what happens when you start moving into the city? And how do you keep your identity alive? How do you prevent yourself from being completely assimilated into mainstream society? So these were kind of the questions that were percolating around in my mind at that time. And when I looked at Bear, I saw myself in that photograph as well, but thinking about what it was like for me when I was young, and the questions that I was dealing with, and the fact that there were no answers, that there was nobody around that could tell me about how it was to cope with the city. Because in my family, because of the proximity of Six Nations to Buffalo, which was only just over an hour drive away, when people got homesick, they could just drive home within an hour. You didn't have to travel thousands of miles to get somewhere else. So when they came to the city to work, it was that. It wasn't necessarily home. So when you had to get that kind of rejuvenation going, you went back to the reserve. But my question was, well, what if you don't have that option? What if you're stuck in the city? What if those links don't exist for a lot of Indigenous people that are born and raised in the city as well, or coming to the city and they can't go home? How do you deal with that? So these were the ideas that started circulating in my mind and thinking about, well, okay, how do we begin to address this? And it was from that point on that I started thinking, or moving towards finding a framework that I could use to actually look at the urban landscape and confront it and come away with something from that landscape. So I moved to Winnipeg a couple years after those first Bear portraits were produced, and I had actually stopped working for about 3 years. I gave up my practice because there were a lot of questions that were coming up that I couldn't answer, and I found myself kind of challenged by the absence of Indigenous photographers at that time. You have to remember, in the early 1980s, I thought I was the only one in North America. And it wasn't until 1984 that they had the first Native American or North American Indian exhibition in Anadarko, Oklahoma. So this was the first group exhibition, and all of a sudden you find out that there were other Indigenous people that were working with the camera around the United States and Canada as well. The following year, in 1985, NEPA was formed in Hamilton, Ontario, and we had a chance to all come together and realize that, boy, there's a lot of us that are out here working and looking at these issues and trying to look at the same kind of issues for the most part. So, but the problem in the beginning was, well, what are we doing? How are we navigating this space? Not only the urban landscape, but also the photographic landscape as well. So it was this long process of developing and trying to find our own voice within this world, and to really have a presence and to ensure that what we were doing was true to who we are as Indigenous people. And so over the years, the bear portraits actually turned into kind of a mapping project for me in terms of bear was the waypoint. He gave me a focal point to work around and away from in looking at the urban landscape. I had now had a focus and a purpose in terms of thinking about my relationship with him, my responsibility as a father to him, as a mentor, and thinking about I want to be able to answer the questions that he has that my elders could not address. So this is how the bear portraits really began to focus, just taking those steps along the way, experimenting, trying things out, seeing how it fits, and trying to find a rhythm within that landscape that things begin to actually move in the direction that you feel like you're finding something to say. And so the series has been kind of going on over the years. I try to make one every year. And it really, in a sense, what I found as well is that it became a ritual. It became a way of that kind of overcoming that colonizer's way of destroying continuity between fathers and sons, and thinking about, okay, how can we do something to bring our own sense of ritual to this world? And that's what the photographs became as well. So it wasn't just a question of my son as a muse, but it was really about addressing Aboriginal men, Indigenous men in our society, and how do we overcome this kind of this structure that's been put in place to destroy that sense of continuity. So essentially, that's what the bear portraits were about. That's how we evolved over a period of time, and it's continuing to evolve and take on a new life as well.
That's really interesting too, because your son is an artist as well. So I wonder also how much did that influence him? I mean, you don't have that to but like just wondering like how much did that positively, influence what he sees the world today. So as far as being an interventionist with these spaces, you've done a lot of intervention, especially with the Champlain Monument, which is the subject of the exhibition. So your work has really opened up the discussion for kind of revising and questioning these types of histories, such as the story of Champlain and other so-called Canadian narratives. I know that you've continued to do this with Seize the Space most recently. I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, if there's something in particular about this monument that you see as kind of unfinished business between you and the monument.
Yeah, unfinished business. It's been going on for quite a long time now in that respect. I should say that I came to Ottawa in 1992 in the fall during the Remembrance Day week, and that year was the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus, and during the summer I had made a trip across Canada, across the United States and Canada, based on the idea of exploration, and thinking that as Indigenous people have we really explored this new world landscape that's here now, and how would you go about doing that? So I traveled across the United States and Canada and came back really frustrated, because I found how do you actually photograph absence in erasure, and how can the camera be used to bring something in terms of a conversation, being able to talk about these issues, being able to point it out. And I should probably reference that in the beginning when I was growing up in Buffalo, I used to go back to the reserve with my grandmother and talk to my elders, and I would talk. As I got older, the questions became more complex in terms of how do I keep my identity alive in the city? How do I practice what you're talking to me about in the city? And of course, my elders never lived in the city, so it was so there wasn't any kind of advice that they could give me in that respect. But what I found is that I thought, okay, what I need are photographs to kind of take back, to send back, to show them what it looks like, the places that I'm visiting and thinking about and trying to confront and challenge. And So when I returned from that trip, all these things were going on in my mind and thinking about, this is an awfully big question, I don't know if I can answer it. A friend had told me about this monument in Ottawa. And she said that Samuel de Champlain monument in Ottawa, and at the base of it is a kneeling Indian, and he's life-size. And she says you have to see it. So we decided to come up to Ottawa during that week and to check it out. And it was an interesting experience walking up the PM Point up to the monument and watching the tourists kind of around that area, and also posing themselves with the Indian, sitting on his knee and things like that, putting their arms around him and all this. And it was what do you do with something like that? What can you make of something like that? What does it mean? How can you challenge a monument that represents the Canadian history and how it positions Indigenous people in relationship to that history, or doesn't position Indigenous people? So I looked at the monument, and these questions were going on about that. And I remember that what I did is, one of the first things that I did is that when I got up close to him and I looked into his face, I was really surprised how lifelike he looked. And I had actually heard a story one time that the sculptor, Hamilton McCarthy, had used an Indigenous person as a model for that figure. And but I didn't know that at the time, but when I approached him, I looked into his face and I just thought, he seems awfully lifelike. And so what I did is, in my mind, I had a series of questions that I began to ask him. And the last one was, I asked him, where would you go if you could leave this place? And it was interesting because the photograph that I made, the last image on that roll of film, was him looking out over the landscape, kind of this very dark, ominous-looking landscape. And I felt a responsibility to him. Like I felt like I had asked him a question that brought up all these hard things to deal with. And I started looking for others that were like him, and thinking about trying to show the type of representation that does exist in the Ottawa landscape. Bear came up to visit me. I think he actually was living with me at that time, and I asked him to go up to the Champlain monument with me, and I wanted to make some new photographs. And like the first Bear portrait, I asked him to pose with the Indian scout, and he did. And we walked around the Parliament grounds as well during that period of time. But once again, what happened was the sense of him next to the monument with a T-shirt that said had FBI in the front of it, which was kind of a play on the FBI and also on full-blooded Indian, and all these questions going on about what's a real Indian and what does this Indian represent. And so that started once again this idea of working around this figure and trying to find some sense of entry point into it, creating a conversation with this figure. And so that's one of the things that happened with the portraits that are in the gallery here now. And that was representative of that day. So there's another one as well where Bear is actually posed right next to the Indian figure as well. And it was from that point on that things began to evolve, and once again, Bear created a point of departure for me and kind of added a sense of mission to my work. And of course, in 1996, I had an exhibition here at the Ottawa Art Gallery, and it was called Portraits from the Dancing Grounds. And in the outside wall, in the lobby area, I had the photograph of the Indian scout on the wall out there. And just after the exhibition closed, at the end of the summer, the Assembly of First Nations held a protest at the Champlain Monument. They went up with a blanket and covered over the Indian, and they cited two specific points that they wanted. They wanted him removed based upon the fact that he didn't really represent the Indigenous part in Canadian history, and that he was inappropriately dressed or not dressed. And so that kind of fluctuated around for a number of years, and what was going to happen to the Indian scout. And so finally, in 1999, he was removed and he was moved across the street to Majorsville Park. So this was kind of the scenario that was going on with the monument, and really thinking about how do we begin to look at that. So here was the crack that took place. He was no longer there. And so what I did in response to that in 2000 was start a new series called Seize the Space. And one of the first people that posed for me was Greg Hill, who's now curator at the National Gallery of Canada. And the story is that the Indian was kneeling because originally the sculptor envisioned him kneeling in the canoe, and he was going to have a paddle in his hand. And but what happened is that the funding was never completed, so the canoe never arrived. So Greg Hill had made a cereal box canoe, and I invited him to bring the canoe up to the monument. We put it on the platform, and then Greg posed inside of it, sitting in the canoe on the platform. And so this was the beginning of looking at Seize the Space and looking at producing a new narrative around that monument. And subsequently, I started inviting people to come up and pose on the platform, and to really look at the platform as the narrative of the Indian now being moved out and kind of replicating that history of colonization, being moved on to reserves, out of sight, out of mind. And it was a perfect metaphor for Canadian history. So in my mind, the little platform became the settler territory. And the people that I was inviting to stand on that space and to pose for me were participants in looking at that narrative. And of course, it's continued on over the years, and in 2013, I produced 260 portraits during the run of Sakahan as part of programming for that exhibition. And so that's been my legacy of working in Ottawa and looking at the Champlain Monument. What was interesting is that when I initially looked at the monument, there was a reaction of, this inappropriateness of it, and kind of, well, you can either look at it and challenge it, or you can just walk away and forget about it. And, but what I found, it was really kind of a beacon for me. So I moved to Ottawa the following year, and I began a project of not only looking for other Indians like him, but also starting a research project at Library and Archives Canada, and looking at their collection and trying to build my own archive of knowledge about this representation, about Canadian history and how we see ourselves figured in with all of those things.
So do you see yourself, I guess, interviewing with any other monuments in the same way? Or?
There's still a lot of monuments out there to do. But the funny thing is that I remember when I traveled across in 1992, I didn't see anything. I made specific stops along the way, like at the Little Bighorn battlefield and different sites like that. But other than that, I didn't really see anything in my day-to-day travels between those sites that had any kind of Indian content. It wasn't until the Champlain Monument kind of awakened me to that. And when I started looking for those things specifically, I was surprised how many there were, especially here around in Ottawa as well. And whenever I traveled, I would be able to find almost every place I went to some sort of monument or architectural decoration or some representations, even cigar store Indians. And I've been finding that there are a lot more around the country and in the United States as well. And so it's kind of an ongoing project. And but I think there comes a time, like I've been doing this for over 35 years now, and I'd like to think that you kind of move past that after a while, like always responding to colonialism and that we have to move on to a new level. Now, what's interesting, during my trip in 1992, I stopped in St. Louis, Missouri, and there they have a site called Cahokia. And it's a series of earth mounds that were made by indigenous people in pre-contact time. And there's roughly 100 mounds that were there, and one of them is 3 stories high. And they're quite remarkable in a sense. And I was really curious about how they survived the transformation of the landscape. What does this site have to say to us today in terms of why it's there, and what does it have to say to us, and where does it take us next? And so my next stage is going back to Cahokia this spring and starting a new body of work that really begins to look at the landscape in terms of without the pressure, without the oppression of always thinking about ourselves and seeing ourselves as victims and having to respond and to recuperate. At some point, you begin to think about what comes next, what kind of art comes out of this experience now when you stop seeing yourself as a victim. And this is the area that I'm going into now. But all these things continue as well. Bear Portraits continues, my series with monuments continues. Another response that I had was called Indians on Tour. I began using little miniature Indian figures and posing them in different places as well, because one of the things is you can't take a monument and move it around wherever you want. So I found that these little Indian figurines, posing them around, was another way to add a level of the mapping of the contemporary landscape and having a focal point where it creates something that you can talk about. This was the bottom line about everything. It was about living in a society that has taken away your voice. Well, how do you bring it back? And it's using these types of interventions in a way to create these points where you can talk about things. I remember, you know, like my elder had said to me, she said, don't forget where you come from. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard the same thing from people in their lives as well. Well, what does that mean? Where do you come from? Well, we're from all over around here. You know, this is our place, this is our homeland. And the best way to do that, to not forget, is to be able to talk about things, to be able to talk about it. And so this is really the basis for my work, is to create these points where you can talk about these things. Even if you don't find an answer right away, it's how do we see ourselves and how do we overcome that sense of invisibility and erasure. We can do it. And so now I'm interested in, okay, so where does it go next? And I don't have an answer, so we'll see what happens next. But one of the things that I loved about photography was the ability of the camera to capture detail. And what I found is that now I want to go the complete opposite. I want to go out of focus and to see what comes from that. But what's interesting too is once again, is also the sense of resistance and continuing that sense of resistance. It's never going to stop. It's always going to be there. And I'm not to diminish the fact that of what's taking place, and it's time to move on because we're still dealing with residential schools and a lot of different issues that have come up. But I also think that in terms of the artist's role, is that we're kind of moving out there into the hinterland, and we're the ones that are going out and exploring and finding all of these different things that need to talk about. And like with the artists and colleagues and friends that I have here as well that are working in this area, that's what it's all about. It's about being able to talk about these things.
And you have a new website now, which it's really awesome. You got a lot of new work up there. And I noticed something that really interested me is something you called cyber cartography. And I think it kind of fit in a little bit with the theme of this exhibition, especially Barry Ace's work, which uses a map. I was just wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that project and the process of mapping, and I guess if this is sort of an ongoing project for you.
Well, when I was planning my trip in 1992, I looked at maps to kind of figure out where I was going to go. And one of the things that I found that was interesting is that when you look at a map, if you find the right map, you'll see, well, where Indians live today. So there'll be reserves and reservations that are marked on the map. And I thought, well, what about all the people that don't live in those sites now? How do we identify ourselves outside of those areas? So from 1992 on, the idea of using the map as a format, once again for addressing invisibility, was a focal point for my thinking. And I looked at my work in terms of, like I had said, is that Bear was a part of that in terms of a presence there. And then looking at the photograph and the different things that I photographed as kind of building an archive of places. But what I found that was most important is that it wasn't about looking at indigenous people. What I was curious about and what I found in photographic history was that that's what photographic history was in terms of looking at Indians. What I wanted to know and what I didn't see when I first started out was what did Indians look at on camera? And so this was the focal point for my work in terms of, this is what I see. And how do you bring all of that together in a format that you can populate a map with? So this was the question that I was looking at. And of course, back in the 90s and that, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have today. So for me, what I was beginning to see is that I was in search of a format for how I wanted to present my work. And I always had this vision of it being a map. And of course, with new technology was the ability to incorporate images into some sort of mapping. And I remember one time I was on a panel at Carleton University in the Cartography and Geomatics department. They had a presentation of this atlas project that they were working on. And I was really interested in it because I thought this is the perfect way to incorporate maps, to incorporate photographs, narratives, audio, video, whatever you wanted to do to populate this map with, seemed like the way to go. And of course, since that time, this was maybe 12 or 15 years ago when I first saw this, so many advances have been made now in terms of the technology for incorporating images or whatever you want to do with map, that it's become the hot thing right now in terms of developments and that. And so this is what I'm looking at in terms of my website. I want to be able to have people come to my website, to be engaged with it, and to see actually the places that I photograph for themselves. They can go to the actual site and see what it looks like, and to look at the map. And I always had this vision of having my own map and have it light up with all of these images on there. And so this is the point that I'm coming to with this technology now. It's an ongoing project with my website. It's kind of slow in a way, but it's a lot of thinking that's coming in as well. I'm thinking about how do you make this happen, and so it's beginning to happen and develop. And I think that's about it for that. I just ran out of thoughts on that.
It's interesting how you're talking about, this, I guess, urban Aboriginal experience. And one thing that comes to mind that I guess some people don't always think about is how many cities in North America were actually built by Aboriginal hands. Especially for my community, there's a lot of men who are iron workers and who, that's sort of how we think of the city in a way. It's like, it's a part of us in a way. Yeah, so, just made me think of that.
You know what I found was interesting in that respect is that when I was in grade school in Buffalo, we had a field trip to the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, and it's the first time I'd ever been in a museum. And I remember that it was pretty boring for the most part until we got to the gift shop. And I looked up on the wall, and there was a black and white photograph, and it was of a monument, and it had an Indian standing at the top of it. And I was really curious about who that guy was, because I'd seen monuments around Buffalo, but I'd never seen one with an Indian on it. And so I found out there was some information there, in that his name was Red Jacket. He was a Seneca chief, and he had lived at the Buffalo Creek Reservation. And I found out that the Buffalo Creek Reservation had actually been the land that Buffalo was built on. And I remember thinking, like, maybe I was, maybe 11, 12 years old, and I thought, here, all of a sudden I had something that was so different from all my friends in that class. I had a history there that none of them had. And it made me feel very differently about the city. And as I almost felt like starting to say that I was born at the Buffalo Creek Reservation instead of the Children's Hospital in Buffalo. But it was that thinking that was behind that. So I was really curious about seeing that monument. And I couldn't get anybody to take me over to where it was. I found out that it was in the Forest Lawn Cemetery. And so eventually I just decided to go on my own. I checked the map and I saw how far it was. It wasn't that far away. And I jumped on my little bike and pedaled over there. Got to the big gates and I looked inside and I couldn't see them. And I was really frustrated because I wanted to go inside, but I wasn't supposed to be there. So I thought if I got caught, then I'd be in trouble. And it's a little scary as well. All these big trees and kind of, it's kind of going into the Black Forest, and I didn't want to do it, so I turned around and I went home. But it was that memory of attempting to do that I think really set the course for what I would do as a photographer in terms of taking the venture and going out beyond and thinking about these things and putting yourself in that world to find out what it feels like and what you have to say about it. But that was the real beginning for a lot of things that began to take place. What was interesting, in 1997, I was working on an exhibition, and I brought Bear with me. We went back to Buffalo, and I went around to see if I could find out where actually the Buffalo Creek Reservation had been. And I found out that the old Seneca settlement on the reservation. So I went over there, and there was a little park now, and there was a big boulder, and it had a plaque on it that talked about that Red Jacket and other people had been buried here. This was the graveyard. This was actually the main community on the reservation. And a guy came up to me, and he said, "So what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I was looking for the Buffalo Creek Reservation." And he said, so we started talking about it. And he said that his ancestors were the first people to move into that area, and they had a farm there, and they developed a relationship with the Seneca people, a good relationship, according to him. And so when they moved away, they designated the area as a park for the cemetery, just out of respect for the people that were there. And he told me that he would come over all the time and clean it up, because kids would party in the park and things, and he would come over and feel obligated to, as a part of his family history, to take care of it. And it was really, really interesting for me to make that contact with him and to talk about it. And then to realize that Red Jacket didn't want to be buried in the Forest Lawn Cemetery. He wanted to stay there, he wanted all of his people to stay there, but they ended up in the Forest Lawn Cemetery anyways. But that was the beginning of looking, at the landscape and thinking about, and like with iron workers and people that do travel, and that I'm sure that there are a lot of people besides myself that think about how all of this land, all of these cities that were here had a prior history that involved our own people. And it's not like we're displaced, living in the city. That's the thing that I find that's fundamental of thinking about how you survive in the city, is that this is your homeland. How do we convey that to people that feel displaced and that have lost their way in the city, and bring that about? So this is really responding to that in terms of self-determination, and thinking about how do we begin to look differently at the places that we were excluded from, and how do we move within those spaces with a sense of purpose and power and a sense of ourselves.
I think your work, it really brings attention to these sort of histories and these experiences, particularly over here in Ottawa, because I guess for myself, your artwork kind of worked as like a guide, like a little guidebook to show me like where these points are in Ottawa. Whereas, living near Montreal my whole life, I don't think I know as much about the history there. There's not so much presence. There's stuff that we know back at home, whatever, oral history, but it isn't acknowledged as much, maybe because here it's the capital, so they have to have these representations. But I think, it's been a little more evidenced here, like this sort of conversation. I think I went through all my questions that I had. If there's anything else that you wanted to add about, I guess, this work, or about spatial intervention in particular?
I think one of the other things that we have to keep in mind in terms of history is that when I talk about photography and what was beginning to take place in the early 1980s, and that Indigenous photographers were actually beginning to find that there were others like them working out there as well. I think it's the same thing with the urban landscape in terms of how it was looked at and not talked about. It was almost, I remember that when I started doing work in the late 1970s, is that no one wanted to identify as being an urban Indian because it was always looked down upon. either, you know, on a reserve. They would see Indians that moved to the city, families that moved to the city, and then they came back acting differently. There was a perception that because you lived in the city, you wanted to be like white people. And then there was also the other side of that was the fact that this was a part of the grand scheme of assimilating indigenous people in the urban centers eventually, was to do away with reserves, to absorb the indigenous community. And so there was a program of, as I said earlier, about erasure and assimilation that went hand in hand. So when I started doing this work, there really wasn't a conversation about that. I remember I was at the University of Buffalo in 1975, and I was in a Native American program there. And I overheard some of my professors who were from the reserve talking about prophecies. And they were talking about who would survive when the Great Change came. And they pointed out that they said, well, all the people that live in the cities won't be saved. It'll just be the people in the reserves. And I thought, I couldn't believe that they were talking in that way. But it brought to mind the fact, and the question, as I mentioned earlier, about Bear and Peon Point with FBI, thinking about full blood and what's a real Indian. And the fact that we have to begin looking at the urban landscape in a way that has cultural significance for us as well. And it has a sense of ritual and a sense of purpose, that we have to build continuity with those spaces. And at some point we have to overcome. And now it's really interesting to look at how people identify themselves as living in urban spaces. And it doesn't carry the same stigma that it did 30 or 40 years ago. So things are beginning to slowly change. But that's the big challenge is that how do we bring these histories up as well? And like I was mentioning about the Mississippian cultures, in Cahokia at one point, it was a massive urban center that supported sometimes, they said, between 15, 30, 40,000 people. It fluctuated, but can you imagine what that was like before Europeans arrived? And what the St. Louis area looked like back then? Now, it's not something that you say, well, we have to go back and live that way, but it does give you a bearing in the sense that we had urban cultures as well. Not only at Cahokia, but in the Southwest and different places. So there was that, and I guess our responsibility is to be able to become the architects of looking at this space and how do we begin to make those changes. We can't build new buildings, but there's a way of taking that on. I remember that when I lived in Winnipeg, I photographed the old Canadian Pacific train station at Higgins and Main Street. And at that time it was closed down. But when I went back in 2013 to have an exhibition, it was open, and it's now called the Aboriginal Center of Winnipeg, I think it is. And so it's kind of an umbrella organization for Indigenous social service organizations in the city. And I had an exhibition in the main rotunda area of my series called The First Spike. And I was thinking about how significant that was in terms of how we begin to appropriate these spaces and make them our own, and how we also as artists begin looking at alternative spaces for our exhibitions as well. That we don't have to be confined to the art gallery, we don't have to be confined to a certain kind of thought about the arts in that, but how does it expand and reach out? And one of the things that I learned from my elder was about being a social activist, and that's what the arts is. It's about being able to become the architects for redefining this space. What do we bring to it now? We have a lot to bring, so.
And you've lived and worked in a lot of different cities. For you, is there any one place that maybe you think needs a little more help than the other, or a place that you feel more comfortable than another?
I don't think so. I think that they've all had their different challenges, but no, I'm thinking more of retirement now. Someplace warm, no snow.
Yeah, so I think that's it for my questions now. It's almost 8 o'clock. Does anybody here have a question for Jeff or for myself?
I have a question for you, Jeff. You talked about, was it Oklahoma where the first really get together for photographers? Was there the idea of the work seen as photojournalism or for art's sake itself? I just wondered about that. The idea of photojournalism versus a serious photography.
I think it was primarily more art-based type of photography. And even like with NEPA the following year, there was photojournalism there as well, not a lot. But what was interesting about that early period is that there weren't a lot of photographers that were working in a straight photographic format. It was more of experimental in terms of meshing photographs with painting with other mediums as well. So it wasn't really clearly defined. But it was really interesting in terms of that there weren't a lot of people that were really looking at the history of photography and carrying on that type of straight documentary photographic work in that. There was some journalism, but yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag. I think it still is.
Anyone else?
You talked about the out of focus or the out of focus. What do you mean by that? Do you mean, are you going to look at your stuff that you have done, or are you looking at new shows on that topic? Because I'm very interested in that as well. Because not everything is in focus, and I'm just looking at how can I present that the out of focus is such a venue as this, right? I find it very interesting.
One of the things that I'm looking at is in terms of ritual, how they came about, and how ritual was transformed from one person's vision into a community activity, and what was at work in terms of the thinking behind something that you saw at that time, and back in hundreds of years ago, there were no cameras to document what it was that you saw or whatever. It was an impression that of something that affected you, and it was manifested through ceremony, through ritual, through dress, through song, through dance. And I'm looking at that now in terms of finding something that I think is interesting, but looking at it in terms of being out of focus, of actually photographing it that way, and then responding to that image in terms of how do you describe it to the public then at that point. Do you use, do you speak about it? Do you use audio? Do you use whatever else is available to you to talk about that story, but not making the photograph the central point of the ritual, but as a point of departure? And then what transpires from there. So it's really kind of a new challenge in that sense, another aspect. Because I think that there's something significant about photography, and I think I've always felt that it has its own indigenous life as well in terms of observation. And that's why I think one of the things, the hallmark of what our elders teach us is how to just sit and listen and watch and not say anything. And we live in a society now that we're bombarded with images, that people talk over each other all the time. There's no sense of respect. And this is what I want to look at, to bring back that sense of how I learned about the world around me and convey that through my photographs. So we'll see where it goes.
Okay. Thanks.
When you were introduced, you were introduced as a curator. So I'm also interested in, you talked about your photographic practice. What's the segue between your art practice and your curatorial interest?
I don't think there is any. I found that I wasn't trained as a curator. I just kind of fell into it because there wasn't anybody else that was curating historical photographs in the Indigenous community. And I applied the same principles that I did to what I was doing as a photographer. So it was kind of, it became a working relationship. And it was fundamental to, let's say, a lot of people are familiar with the work I've done with Edward Curtis and looking at his work and trying to find some sense of meaning in his work and getting beyond the white man looking at the Indian that, well, what do those people have to say in those photographs? So for me, it was a sense of trying to build a new way of communication between the past. And of course, for Indigenous people, there isn't any difference between it. It's all one. And so when I started working as a curator, it was the same principle that came to mind as well, because my work as a curator, all the exhibitions that I worked on have been historically based, except for a couple that have been more contemporary based. What it was like when I curated the show for the Museum of Civilization in 1998, Emergence from the Shadow. It started out as a specifically historical photo-based exhibition of the anthropologist's work. And during the curatorial process, I found that there was something missing here. And what was missing was that my fear of the images coming into the public forum just as oddities. And so what I did is then I suggested to the museum that we add a second component of contemporary Aboriginal artists. Of course, you were one of them, and Rosalie was one. And it was really about the works coming out into the public for the first time in their own community. So in my mind, it was an extension of the way that I looked at historical photographs in relationship to my own work. And then as a curator, I began looking at this relationship as well. And so that was really, yeah, it was just kind of an overlap. And, but once again, it was trying to break down that barrier between past and present.
You had mentioned how the image of a man, like the one, the kneeling man at Champlain Point, sort of evoked questions about identity and presence or lack of presence. And I'm wondering if there's other imagery or symbols that sort of evoke those same questions or trigger those same questions, whether they're things like animals or things in the landscape or any other sort of emotions besides a man that might trigger those same type of questions. Or
I found that when I was living in Winnipeg, I was walking down an alley one time, and what drew me down the alley was this painted sign that said, if you don't love me, I still love you. And I got to that. So I was walking down this alley, and it was covered with graffiti, and as I got closer and I looked at it, I noticed that underneath the sign was a pair of old work boots. And I thought, it brought back my own memories of my relationship with my father and the hardships that I remembered from our relationship. And so I started feeling like this alleyway closing in on me. And it was pretty narrow. And there were 3 ways that you could walk out of it. And I thought it was really an interesting metaphor for the challenges that we face and the routes that we take. And thinking about Winnipeg and how marginalized Indigenous people are, and how many times I walked through different alleyways in Winnipeg and I saw Indigenous people in those alleyways. So there was something about it that I thought, what sense of hope can you find in this place? And it was similar to the work that I've done with, with monuments and architectural figures and things like that, of looking at them and wondering about how do we incorporate that. And I remember that one of the interesting things that I loved about Winnipeg was looking up and watching the clouds cut through the city. And I remember that it had a really strong impact on me, and I thought, and it reminded me of some things that I had learned. So there was this from my elders, and I thought, okay, it's the sky. And from that point on, for quite a few years, I incorporated sky into my photographs. I was working in black and white during that period of time. But then when I started working in color, it was the same thing. It was always having whatever it was that I was photographing had an element of the sky in it as well. Because I saw the blueness, the clouds, the movement, linked to what I had learned when I was younger. So that was an element of that as well. And of course, it also became a part of the photographs. So even like the work that I did at Nepean Point in 2013, it was making portraits of people, but it was also incorporation of the landscape as well, things that are still less unmolested than a lot of things that are on the ground level, and with the water as well. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that there's there's a sense of whatever you look at, there's always finding a relationship in it. Even if it's looking at a historical photograph, the first thing that comes to mind is, I see human beings in this photograph, and what do they have to say? And so my mind starts looking for a way to make that happen. So it's with photographs, with paintings, it's whatever I look at and whatever I do, it's that same feeling. Is what is its relationship to the larger human element that we're a part of, in the natural world around us. It's all of these things. It's what we're connected to that I see. So.
You just made me think of something I hadn't thought about for a long time. When that time period in Winnipeg, when you were in the clouds, there would always be these moments where, like, hey Barry, run over there, the clouds are perfect. That's what I'm running in the landscape for clouds. Well, I wanted to ask you, did you ever print the photos from when we revisited that alleyway a couple of years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, I just haven't used it yet. But, it's going to be a part of the story. And in fact, with the Bear portraits, this is the next stage that's going to be taking place, is that I'm going to record Bear's response to all the photographs that I've made over the years, beginning with the first one. Because he claims that he remembers every one of them. So I'm going to put him on the spot. But over the years, what was interesting is people would often ask me when I gave a talk is, well, what does Bear think about your photographs? Do you ever feel like you're misusing him and taking advantage of him? And does he know what's going on? And so I asked him one time, did you know what was going on? And I remember one time he said that for all of them, no, that he only knew that I was doing something and he felt that it was important to take part in it, so he willingly posed for me. But I thought at some point what I have to add to this project as well is what he saw and what he felt in the photographs. So that's going to be an ongoing project that will be taking place hopefully this spring as well. So as I said before, all of these works, they continue to evolve and take on new life over time. But yeah, that's the idea. So I never remember asking him to stand somewhere with that kind of enthusiasm or urgency. So it'll be interesting to add that to the photographs.
Is there anyone before me? No. Okay. Kind of on that note, I think what has been the most powerful, and what sticks with me the most in those moments of talking to you, when I realized, and as you say, the archives stood in for these relationships that you can have, and also when you talked about being the avatar for Scouts. And so I'm really interested, and you talked about this, your work is quite performative in that it's shifting spaces, whether that's like, you know, people on Union Point and sort of embodying that settler space. Yeah, I'm not asking you a question, I just want you to talk more about the relationship part, and that idea of the relationships that were missing, the archive became a part of it, to fill that in, to fill that space, and also the way that Scouts started to fill that space for you.
When the first time that I went up to the PM Point, and one of the ways that I looked at the monument, and what I thought about the tourists that posed themselves with the Indian figure, is that I imagined it like a merry-go-round, and that people would stand next to him and take in the world from his perspective and what it looks like. So let's say, first of all, you take the first one, which is with Champlain. You go up to the top, and you circle around, and you get that national narrative that's going on, and all the good things that transpired about from that. And in that narrative, we forget about what happened to Indigenous people in that process. So then we come down and we stand at the bottom with the Indian, and we take that circle around, but we go the opposite direction. And we start thinking about him talking about what was going on, how he feels being on that monument, on that platform. And how does he begin to negotiate that space? As I said when I first started, was I asked him, where would you go if you could leave this place? And just imagine what it would be like for this 16th century Indian man on this spot, having to go out into this world and make his way. Now, one of the hardest things I think to convey to the general public are the issues that we deal with and the way that we see ourselves. We're not 16th century Indians, but in our mind, we're still Indian, and we see the world in a particular way. How does he negotiate this landscape? So he became a metaphor for that sense of going out there, and my role of becoming a scout for him, and thinking about my work in terms of how do I pave a way for him for his reintroduction into the 21st century landscape. What is involved in that? And of course it has that, as I talked about earlier as well, it's about how do we negotiate these spaces. So it's turning this Bronze Indian into something as a teacher as well. And so that's how I began to look at that in terms of asking those questions. So it's even I remember, you know, when I was growing up and I was talking, and I had so many questions in my mind, but I couldn't formulate them into words to ask my elders about it. But now I see the way that it comes about and how it's come into my practice and how I use that. So taking that point, the P and point, as a point of departure and thinking about exploration and navigation and how do we go about doing that. One of the things that I began doing was incorporating GPS technology using a handheld receiver as part of my work so that I can actually map the routes that I take and also collect the longitude and latitude for all of those spaces and add it to this map that I'm working on. And using that as a teaching tool as well about exploration once again. I think that answered the question.
It's okay.
I got off on a tangent there again.
Does anyone else have a question? I was just thinking through, it's kind of funny with the stuff you're talking about, and where we were moving to this room with these kind of group of 7 artworks, and it's okay, Aboriginal people here, so kind of funny.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, if that's it, then I guess we'll